The crisp white tablecloth felt like a shroud. To Mark, the man at the end of the table was just a ghost, an inconvenient specter at the feast of his own meticulously curated success. He was Arthur, his father-in-law, a relic from a simpler, poorer time, and in Mark's gleaming modern world, he was an anomaly, a smudge on a perfect photograph. Mark lifted his champagne flute, the crystal catching the light from the grand ballroom's chandeliers, and a smirk played on his lips. His audience, a collection of junior partners, tech investors, and their immaculately dressed wives, leaned in, sensing the beginning of familiar, cruel performance. "And I'd like to make a special toast," Mark began, his voice dripping with condescending magnanimity, "to my father-in-law, Arthur, for being here." A few sycophantic chuckles rippled through the table. Arthur didn't react. He simply sat there, his back straight, his eyes, the color of a faded summer sky, fixed on a point beyond the shimmering artifice of the room. He was a statue of forgotten things. To them, he was just an old man, a charity case, the silent, unimpressive father of a beautiful, successful woman who had clearly married up. But what they didn't know, what the polished crystal and tailored suits and casual cruelty could never reveal, was the truth of the man behind those eyes. They saw a quiet, unassuming elder. They had no idea they were in the presence of a legend, a man who had walked through the deepest fires of a hidden world and emerged with silence forged in crucible sacrifice. They saw weakness in his stillness, but his stillness was a fortress, built brick by brick from memories of courage they couldn't even imagine. Welcome to our channel, where we uncover the stories of quiet honor that walk unseen among us. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, and that heroes are often found in the most unexpected places, then be sure to like this video and subscribe for more tales that matter. The ballroom was a symphony of Mark's ambition. Every floral arrangement, every perfectly folded napkin, every note from the string quartet was a testament to his ascent. He had designed the evening as a monument to himself, celebrating a recent promotion that placed him firmly in the upper echelons of his financial firm. His wife, Sarah, Arthur's daughter, floated through the room with a practiced smile, but her eyes kept drifting back to her father. She saw him sitting alone, a small, still island in a turbulent sea of chatter and laughter. His suit, though clean and pressed, was decades out of style. It was the same suit he wore to her wedding, and likely the one he would wear to his grave. It fit him in a way his surroundings did not, a simple statement of fact in a room full of exaggeration. She watched as Mark approached him, clapping a hand on his shoulder with a theatricality that made her wince. She saw the casual disdain in her husband's posture, the way he leaned in as if confiding a great secret, but spoke just loudly enough for those nearby to hear. Arthur's hands rested on his knees, weathered and scarred, the knuckles swollen with age. One hand, she had noticed since she was a little girl, always seemed to be near his pocket, where the faint outline of a heavy, round object was just visible. He never spoke of it. He never spoke of much at all from the time before she was born. Her mother, gone now for 10 years, had always called it his thinking piece. To Mark, it was just more evidence of the old man's simplicity, another odd quirk of a life that had amounted to so little. Arthur's gaze swept the room, not with envy, but with a calm, analytical detachment. He saw the hierarchies, the subtle power plays, the desperate need for validation in the eyes of the young men who orbited her husband. It was a battlefield of a different kind, one fought with whispers and stock options instead of steel and grit, but the human dynamics were hauntingly familiar. He was not impressed. He had seen empires rise from dust and fall to ash, and he knew the fragility of the foundations upon which men like Mark built their kingdoms. He had learned, in the harshest classrooms the world had to offer, that the only thing a man truly owned was his word, his honor, and the space between his own 2 feet. Mark's world was built on sand, and Arthur could feel the tide coming in. His life was a study in quiet discipline, a stark contrast to the chaotic, digitally saturated existence of his daughter and her husband. Arthur's small apartment, 2 rooms over a quiet bakery, was a sanctuary of order. The scent of fresh bread in the morning and the low hum of the city were his constant companions. He rose before the sun, not because of an alarm, but because of the clockwork built into his very bones, a rhythm established in years of standing the pre-dawn watch. His movements were economical, precise, making his bed the corner's perfect military folds, brewing coffee in an old percolator, the aroma a daily comfort. He would sit by a single window, looking out at the waking city, and the silence of his small space would hold him. It was a silence filled not with emptiness, but with the ghosts of distant lands, the echoes of unheard conversations, the faces of men he had known. His few possessions were treated with a reverence that Mark would have found laughable. A small collection of worn paperback books, their spines cracked and soft, a framed photograph of his late wife, her smile still bright, and on his simple wooden nightstand, a heavy bronze-colored coin, its face worn smooth from decades of handling. The coin was his totem, his anchor to a life he had locked away. One side depicted a snarling eagle, its talons gripping a trident. The other, an inscription, now so faded it was almost illegible, but the words were burned into his soul. Silentium et celeritas. Silence and speed. Mark, on the other hand, lived in a sprawling glass house that was less a home and more a statement. It was cold, minimalist, and filled with the latest technology that beeped and glowed and listened. He communicated in bursts of jargon and acronyms, his life a frantic race from one quarterly goal to the next. He saw Arthur's quiet life not as a choice, but as a failure to compete, a failure to accumulate, a failure to be important. He'd once visited Arthur's apartment, a forced duty at his wife's insistence, and had looked around with a barely concealed pity. Cozy, he had called it, the word landing with the weight of an insult. He'd tried to help Arthur, offering to buy him a new television, a new phone, anything to drag the old man into the current century. Arthur had politely but firmly refused. "I have what I need," he had said, his voice quiet but absolute. This refusal baffled Mark. It was a rejection of everything he valued, and he took it as a personal affront. Sarah was the bridge between these two worlds, and the weight of it was beginning to wear her down. She loved her father's gentle strength, his unwavering calm. But she also loved her husband, and she craved the stability and security he provided. She would watch them together, her father listening patiently while Mark pontificated about market trends or digital disruption, and she would feel a deep, unsettling dissonance. It was as if she were watching a lion being lectured by a gazelle. The narrator's voice would speak over a shot of Arthur tracing the eagle on his coin, the camera focusing on the faded letters. The irony was a chasm. Mark, in his ignorance, believed he was a powerful one. He thought he was in control. He had no concept of the man he was patronizing, no understanding that Arthur's quiet deference was not weakness, but profound act of restraint, a restraint that was about to be tested beyond its limits. The string quartet faded, and a polite smattering of applause filled the momentary silence. Mark remained standing, holding his glass, his smile widening. He had their attention. He had the stage. This was his element. "You know," he continued, his gaze falling once more upon Arthur, "it's a funny thing, family. We all come from different places. Some of us strive. We build. We create legacies." He gestured around the opulent room, a clear indication of his own created legacy. And others, well, others provide a valuable lesson in simplicity. The word hung in the air, a poisoned dart aimed directly at his father-in-law. Sarah, standing near the edge of the table, felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. "Mark, don't," she whispered, but he either didn't hear her or chose to ignore her. He was playing to crowd. "Arthur here. He's from a different era. A time when a man didn't have to have a 5-year plan or a diversified portfolio. Life was simpler then." He took a theatrical sip of his champagne. The silence from Arthur's end of the table was absolute, a void that seemed to pull all the sound from the room toward it. A few of Mark's friends, younger men who saw him as a mentor, laughed a little too loudly. The older guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They recognized the cruelty for what it was. The moment stretched, becoming brittle. Then Mark did the unforgivable. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and extracted a crisp new $50 bill. He walked the length of the table and, with a flourish, laid it on the white tablecloth in front of Arthur. "Here you go, old-timer," he said, his voice oozing a false sincerity that was more insulting than open mockery. "A little something for your trouble." I know the trip into the city can be a lot. The act was so breathtakingly condescending that a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. All eyes were on Arthur. This was the moment of ultimate public humiliation. He was being treated not just as a poor relation, but as a child, a beggar. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She started to move forward, to snatch the bill off the table, to scream at her husband, but she was frozen by her father's reaction. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at the money. His gaze lifted slowly from the middle distance and met Mark's. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no shame. There was only a vast, profound, and terrifying sadness. It was the look of a man watching a foolish child play with a loaded gun. In that single, silent glance, Sarah saw something shift. She saw a depth in her father she had never comprehended, a power held in check, a sorrow that was ancient and immense. It was the look of a king in beggar's robes, and for the first time, she felt a sliver of fear not for her father, but for her husband. The $50 bill lay on the table, a garish testament to an ignorance so profound it was almost a form of innocence. Arthur's silence was his answer. It was a shield. It was a judgment. And Mark, utterly deaf to its meaning, took it as victory. Mark, misreading the stunned silence of the room as admiration for his audacity, felt a surge of arrogant power. The old man hadn't fought back. He had folded, just as Mark knew he would. He saw Arthur's quiet sorrow not as a judgment it was, but as a pathetic resignation of a defeated man. He turned back to his audience, puffing out his chest. See? A simple man, grateful for the small things. The lie was so blatant, so disconnected from the reality of the moment, that it bordered on the psychotic. He had taken an act of supreme dignity and twisted it into a pathetic caricature. The disrespect, having reached its peak, now began to metastasize. Emboldened, Mark decided to elaborate on his theme, to paint a fuller picture of the man he had so thoroughly vanquished. "I've tried to get Arthur to tell me stories about his life," he said, leaning against the table with a casual air. What he did before he retired, what great adventures he had. He paused for dramatic effect. "Turns out, there's not much to tell. Worked a few odd jobs," he says. "Security here, a bit of manual labor there. A quiet life." As he spoke, the camera would perform a slow zoom on Arthur's right hand, which rested on the table just inches from the insulting $50 bill. His thumb began to move, almost imperceptibly, tracing a small circle on the tablecloth. The narrator's voiceover would cut in low and reverent. A quiet life. That's what he called it. He didn't call it the jungles of Laos. So dense the sun was a myth. He didn't call it the frozen peaks of the Hindu Kush, where the air was too thin to breathe and every shadow held a threat. He didn't call it the forgotten firefights in unnamed villages, the desperate struggles for survival that were erased from official records before the smoke had even cleared. He called it a quiet life, because the alternative was to speak of things that men like Mark used to sell movie tickets and video games. He called it quiet because the noise of it, the true sound of it, still echoed in his soul, a sound he could not inflict on the clean, safe world his daughter now inhabited. Mark continued his oblivious monologue. I asked him if he was ever in the service. Lots of guys his age were. He just said, "Once." That was it. Once. Okay, Rambo, settle down. The laughter this time was more strained, more hesitant. Even Mark's most ardent sycophants were beginning to sense that the joke had curdled. Sarah, her face pale with a mixture of shame and a strange, dawning premonition, watched her father's hand. She saw his thumb tracing that invisible circle, a motion she now realized was deeply familiar. He did it when he was thoughtful, when he was worried, when he was looking at something far, far away. She saw him dip his other hand into his coat pocket, and for a second, she thought he was going to pull out the old coin. But he didn't. His fingers just closed around it, a secret source of strength. Mark, now fully committed to his narrative, gestured dismissively toward Arthur. So let's hear for quiet men, the simple men, the ones who remind us high flyers what we're all working so hard to leave behind. It was a final twist of the knife, framing Arthur's life not just as a failure, but as a cautionary tale. And it was in that exact moment, the moment of Mark's ultimate, self-satisfied hubris, that the world quietly changed its axis. The grand doors of the ballroom, manned by 2 uniformed hotel staff, swung silently open. It wasn't a dramatic, crashing entrance. It was a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, a cool draft of air, a new presence. At first, only the staff noticed, their professional composure snapping to a rigid, almost military attention. A hushed, urgent whisper passed between the maitre d' and a senior manager. Their eyes were wide, fixed on the figures who had just entered. From across the room, all that could be seen was a small group of men, 3 of them standing just inside the doorway. They were not dressed for a party. They were dressed in the severe, immaculate lines of formal military uniforms. The camera would start low, focusing on a pair of perfectly polished black dress shoes. They were motionless, but they seemed to command the very ground on which they stood. The shot would pan up slowly, over the razor-sharp crease of trouser leg, to a jacket adorned with a breathtaking array of medals and ribbons. They were not the gaudy trinkets of a parade officer. They were the somber, respected decorations of a lifetime of command and conflict. While this silent, potent arrival was unfolding, Mark remained oblivious, lost in his own echo chamber. He had escalated from condescension to outright dismissal. Seeing a hotel security guard lingering nervously at the edge of the room, Mark beckoned him over. "Excuse me," Mark said with an air of supreme authority. "I think my father-in-law is a little tired. He seems confused." He gestured toward Arthur. "Could you please do me a favor and help him find his way to the lobby? I'll have a car sent for him." He was trying to have Arthur physically removed. It was the ultimate act of erasure, of casting out the unwanted, the unimpressive. The security guard, a young man with nervous eyes, looked from the supremely confident Mark to the unervingly still Arthur, and then back again. He took a hesitant step forward. Sarah let out a small, strangled cry. "Mark, no. Stop it," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Just stop." But Mark waved her away as if she were a gnat. "Darling, it's for the best. He's not comfortable here." This was the absolute zenith of his arrogance. He believed he had the power to summarily eject a man from his own daughter's celebration, to have him escorted out like a trespasser. The tension in the room was now a physical entity, a high-frequency hum that set everyone's teeth on edge. The guests were no longer pretending to enjoy themselves. They were watching a train wreck in slow motion, a disaster of social graces and human decency. The security guard was now within a few feet of Arthur's table, his hand half raised as if to touch his shoulder. "Sir," the guard began, his voice trembling slightly. Arthur did not look at him. His eyes were still fixed on Mark, that same look of profound, sorrowful judgment on his face. And it was into this tableau of supreme disrespect that the central figure from the doorway began to move. He walked with a purpose that parted the crowd like a ship's bow through water. No one spoke. No one moved to stop him. There was an aura of absolute, unquestionable authority about him that silenced all protest. The camera would stay on his back, watching his steady, rhythmic pace as he crossed a vast, silent ballroom on a direct and unswerving collision course with Mark's petty kingdom. The man in the uniform was tall and silver-haired, his posture as straight and unyielding as a flagpole. His uniform was that of a 4-star general of the United States Army, a fact not lost on a few guests who recognized the insignia. But even to those who didn't, the sheer weight of his presence was overwhelming. He moved without haste, yet he covered the ground with intimidating efficiency. The air crackled around him. The string quartet had long since fallen silent. The only sound was a faint, rhythmic tap of his dress shoes on the polished marble floor. Mark finally turned, annoyed by the sudden shift in the room's attention, his face a mask of irritation. Who dared to steal his spotlight at the very moment of his triumph? He saw the approaching figure, the uniform, the medals, and his expression shifted from irritation to confusion. He assumed it was a hotel dignitary or a lost politician. The general's eyes, a piercing, intelligent blue, scanned the room once, taking in the entire scene in a fraction of a second. He saw the weeping Sarah. He saw the arrogant, preening Mark. He saw the embarrassed, silent guests. And then his eyes found Arthur, and they stopped. A flicker of something profound and complex crossed the general's face. Disbelief, recognition, and then an overwhelming, bone-deep respect that bordered on pure reverence. He ignored Mark completely, bypassing him as if he were a piece of furniture. He walked the final few feet to Arthur's table and came to a halt. The young security guard froze, his hand still hovering in the air, and then slowly, instinctively, took a step back, then another. The general stood before Arthur, saying nothing for a long moment. It was a silence more profound than any speech, a tableau of two worlds colliding, the world of silent service and the world of loud self-aggrandizement. Finally, the general's voice, a low baritone accustomed to command, cut through the stillness. It was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "Arthur," he said, the name a question filled with decades of history. "I thought that was you." Mark's jaw went slack. He looked back and forth between the decorated general and the simple old man in the cheap suit. The two figures seemed to exist in different realities. How could this titan of a man possibly know his pathetic father-in-law? Arthur, for the first time that evening, shifted his gaze from Mark. He looked up at the general, and a faint, tired flicker of recognition lit his eyes. He gave a single, small nod, the nod of an equal. "General," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, betraying no surprise, no elation, just a simple statement of fact. The general's shoulders seemed to relax, a small smile touching his lips. It was a smile of relief, of confirmation. He pulled out the chair next to Arthur and, without asking for permission, sat down. He leaned in, not to whisper, but to speak in a normal tone that was somehow more commanding than a shout. "It's been a long time," the general said, his eyes never leaving Arthur's face. Too long. The room held its breath. This was a conversation they were not meant to hear, a chapter from a book they didn't even know existed. Mark stood there, utterly forgotten, a superfluous character in a story that was suddenly, terrifyingly, not about him at all. The $50 bill still lay on the table between the two old soldiers, a monument to an ignorance that was about to be spectacularly and devastatingly corrected. The general sat for another moment, his gaze fixed on Arthur, a silent communion passing between them that no one else could interpret. Then, as if sensing the collective, breathless confusion of the room, he slowly turned. His body shifted, and his posture seemed to grow even more rigid, more imposing. His eyes, which had been filled with warmth for Arthur, now swept across the assembled guests, as cold and sharp as chips of ice. They finally landed on Mark. They did not glare with anger. They did not burn with rage. They settled with a look of such profound disappointment and clinical contempt that it was 1,000 times more devastating. Mark physically flinched, as if struck. The general did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His tone was calm, measured, and carried the absolute weight of irrefutable truth. It was the voice of a man who had sent other men to their deaths and had borne the weight of it every day since. It was the voice of history itself. "I was attending a charity function in the adjacent hall," the general began, his voice cutting through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel. "My aide informed me that a man was causing a disturbance in this room, but it appears I was misinformed." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "The disturbance, I see now, is not a man. It is a vacuum of decency, a vacuum of honor." He looked directly at Mark, who had turned a ghastly shade of pale. "This man," the general said, gesturing toward Arthur with a reverence that was both shocking and beautiful, "whose quiet presence you seem to find so offensive, is Master Chief Petty Officer Arthur Jensen. At least, that was his title when I last had the honor of serving under his command." A murmur went through the room. Under his command? A 4-star general had served under this quiet old man? The screen would flash with simple, stark white text against a black background. Master Chief Petty Officer Arthur Jensen, U.S. Navy SEALs. Retired. The general continued, his voice building in a slow, powerful crescendo. "You speak of building legacies," he said, his eyes burning into Mark. "This man's legacy is not written in stock portfolios or quarterly reports. It is written in the blood and sacrifice of missions that you will never read about, in places your maps don't even show. This man is a founding member of a unit so elite, so secret, that its very existence is still classified. On-screen text, Development Group, SEAL Team 6, Plank Owner. You mock him for his silence. The general's voice grew thick with controlled, righteous anger. Let me tell you about his silence. His silence was earned in the jungles of Vietnam, where he held a line against an enemy force 10 times his size for 3 days, protecting his wounded comrades until extraction. His silence was forged in the mountains of Afghanistan, on a mission so critical that the safety of this nation depended on it. On that mission, he was the last man out, carrying a wounded teammate for 5 miles through enemy territory. The general's own eyes seemed to mist over with the memory. I was that wounded teammate, he said, his voice dropping to an almost whisper, raw with emotion. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The general then listed Arthur's commendations, not with pride, but with a kind of holy reverence. For these actions, he was awarded the Navy Cross. He also holds 2 silver stars, for Bronze Stars of Valor and a Purple Heart. He refused the Medal of Honor because, in his words, I was just doing my job. The real heroes didn't come home. On-screen text flashed with each medal: Navy Cross, Silver Star X2, Bronze Star with V X4, Purple Heart. The general stood up, his full height seeming to dominate the entire ballroom. He looked down at Mark, a man so diminished he seemed to be physically shrinking. So you will forgive me, the general said, his voice now like cold steel, if I don't find your little performance amusing. You stand in the shadow of a giant, and you are so small you cannot even see the sun. The general's final words echoed in the cavernous silence that followed. The air was thick with shame, a palpable miasma that seemed to emanate directly from Mark, enveloping him in his table of stunned sycophants. No one moved. No one spoke. The clinking of glasses, the hum of chatter, the music, it was all gone, replaced by a silence that was heavier and more profound than any sound. It was the silence of a truth so absolute it obliterated everything that had come before it. The general, his duty done, turned his back on the humiliated Mark. His face softened as he looked once more at Arthur. He reached down, and with a gentleness that belied his powerful frame, he placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. The gesture was one of deep affection, of a shared history that transcended rank and time. It is an honor to see you, Master Chief, he said, his voice once again quiet, for Arthur's ears only. But in the dead silent room, everyone heard it. Then he did something that shattered the last vestiges of Mark's reality. The 4-star general, a man who commanded armies, a man who advised presidents, straightened his back and gave a short, sharp, respectful nod. It was a salute. The context was wrong, but it was a civilian equivalent, an unmistakable sign of deference, a public acknowledgement of a hierarchy not of rank, but of valor. Mark stood as if turned to stone, his face a grotesque mask of shock and mortification. His cleverness, his wit, his carefully constructed world of superiority, it had all been dismantled, atomized in the space of a 2-minute speech. His friends, the ones who had laughed at his cruel jokes, now stared at their plates, at the ceiling, anywhere but at him. They were distancing themselves from his disgrace, their loyalty as shallow as his honor. Sarah watched it all through a blur of tears. But her tears were no longer of shame for her father, but of a fierce, overwhelming pride that was so intense it was painful. She was looking at a stranger, a hero who had hidden in plain sight her entire life. She saw the quiet man who taught her to ride a bike, who read her bedtime stories, who sat in his quiet apartment with his memories. And she saw the legend the general had described, and she realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that they were the same man. The quietness wasn't emptiness. It was a container for all the things he had done, all the things he had seen. Her gaze fell on her husband, and for the first time, she felt nothing but a cold, empty pity for him. He hadn't just insulted her father. He had exposed his own soul and had found it wanting. Arthur, the center of this maelstrom, remained serene. He had not reveled in the general's words. He had not glanced at Mark to witness his humiliation. He simply absorbed the moment as he had absorbed everything else in his life, with quiet, unbreakable stoicism. He gave the general a slow, appreciative nod, a silent acknowledgement of a debt of truth, if not of rescue. The story was told. The record was set straight, and the weight of it settled over the room, changing everyone and everything. The spell was broken not by a word, but by a movement. Arthur pushed his chair back, the soft scrape of wood on marble, the only sound in the funereal silence. He stood up slowly, his body aching with the quiet pains of an old warrior. The room watched his every move. He was no longer the invisible old man. He was the focus of every eye, a figure of immense and mysterious power. He did not look at Mark. He did not need to. The judgment was complete. He turned his gaze to his daughter, Sarah, and their eyes met across the space that had suddenly opened between them. In his look, there was no, "I told you so," no hint of triumph. There was only love, a deep, steady, and forgiving love. He gave her the smallest of smiles, a barely perceptible upturn of the corners of his mouth. And it was enough. It told her everything she needed to know, that he was all right, that he loved her, and that this entire, ugly episode was already in his past. With that silent farewell, he turned and began to walk toward the exit. He moved with that same steady, unassuming pace, his slight limp a reminder of a history now made public. The crowd of guests, frozen moments before, now seemed come alive, parting for him with an unconscious, instinctual respect. They cleared a path, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and wonder. As he walked, he passed the general, who simply stood at attention, his eyes following Arthur with the unwavering gaze of a loyal soldier watching his commander leave the field. Arthur did not seek the attention. He did not want the accolades. The truth had been a burden he had carried silently for decades, and its sudden release had not lightened his load, but merely shifted it. He wanted only what he had always wanted, the quiet solitude of his own well-earned peace. He reached the grand ballroom doors and walked through them without a backward glance, disappearing into the hallway, leaving behind the wreckage of one man's pride and the dawn of another man's legend. The narrator's voice returns, calm and reflective, and so the hero departed, not with a fanfare, not with parade, but in the same way he had lived his life, quietly and with a dignity that needed no external validation. The vindication was not for him. He had never needed it. The vindication was for the truth itself. Mark's plan had been to be clever, to use his father-in-law as a prop to elevate himself. But he had not known what he was dealing with. He had not known that some truths are like lions. They do not need to be defended. You just have to let them out of their cage. The real plan, the one written in the ledgers of fate and character, was never Mark's to begin with. It was Arthur's. Not a plan of revenge, but a plan of integrity. A plan to live a life so honorable that, in the end, it would speak for itself, in a voice louder than any insult. In the now devastated ballroom, Mark was left alone, a king in a kingdom of ashes. His guests began to drift away, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of his public disgrace. His cleverness was revealed as a profound and childish ignorance, and he was left with the silence and the faint, lingering presence of a greatness he could never hope to understand. The story ends where it began, but everything has changed. We see Arthur back in his small, quiet apartment. The sounds of the city below are a distant, comforting murmur. The moonlight streams through his window, illuminating the simple, orderly room. He is sitting in his worn armchair, the one his late wife had always loved. The room is filled with profound peace, a stark contrast to the emotional violence of the ballroom. He holds a heavy bronze coin in his hand. The moonlight catches on its worn surface, the snarling eagle and the faded trident seeming to pulse with a faint, ancient light. He turns it over and over, his thumb tracing the smooth, familiar edges. It is a ritual of comfort, of memory, of grounding. It connects him to the man he was, and the man he has chosen to be. A single tear traces a path down his weathered cheek, carving a line to the landscape of his wrinkles. It is not a tear of sadness for the insults he endured. It is not a tear of triumph for the vindication he received. It is a tear of memory, a tear for the ghosts who stand with him in the quiet room, the faces of the brothers he lost, the echoes of the promises he kept. It is the quiet grief of a survivor, the immense, solitary weight of a long life lived with honor. The narrator's voice speaks over this final, poignant image. We are surrounded by ghosts and by heroes. Often, They are one and the same. They are the quiet men and women who walk among us. Their stories hidden behind tired eyes and humble clothes. They ask for nothing. They seek no applause. They carry the weight of their service in silence. Their honor a private, sacred thing. The true measure of a person is not found in the noise they make or the wealth they accumulate, but in the quiet integrity of their character, in the courage they show when no one is watching. It is in the space between what they have done and what they are willing to speak of. The final shot is a close-up of the challenge coin, resting on a simple wooden nightstand next to the photo of his smiling wife. His hand has released it. He is at peace. The narrator now addresses the audience directly, the tone shifting from reverent storytelling to gentle engagement. What do you think is the true measure of a man or a woman? Is it their worldly success or the quiet honor with which they live their lives? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one. And if you were moved by Arthur's story and believe in celebrating the unseen heroes all around us, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell. You won't want to miss the powerful stories we have coming next. Thank you for watching.